everybody, and good morning, and welcome to today's webinar, which is the final of the Scottish agronomy series, online this year, unfortunately, but equally no less enjoyed, hopefully. So I'm chairing this session. I'm Michele from the Knowledge Exchange team at AHDB and Cereals and Oilseeds. And today we are going to be looking at growing a sustainable future. And it's a PAC programme, and I'm delighted that you've joined us on this session. So as always, with all meetings, we've got a couple of housekeeping points just to kick us off. So we will encourage questions. There is going to be a panel discussion at the end of this webinar. As I said, it is a PAC programme, so you might find that all of the questions get saved till that moment, but we'll keep going through. So do send those questions in. All attendees are muted. We can't see or hear you. So if you do want to get in contact, do send those messages in. And again, it is a recorded session, so you can catch up with this at a later time if you want to. And we are looking to finish around 12:30. So basis and Eroso points. This webinar does have basis and Eroso points. To claim those points, if you can put your details into the Q&A box. So just be careful, not the chat box, they need to go into the Q&A box, and those are the details you need for either basis or Eroso. So, as you said, this is the third and final of the Agronomy Roadshow series. If you have missed the others and you want to catch up, those videos will also be available, but this is where we are right now. So a quick update from AHDB. So we have got Strategic Farm in Scotland. It's got its 2021 results with the season updates and an open day, and looking forward very much to the 2022 results. And David will actually be joining us later in this webinar. AHDB Scotland generally, so we are still recruiting for a KM to look after Scotland, but don't doubt that I'm sure a few of us are more than happy to come and support where needed, and we look forward to working with you all. And the biggest thing that's going on at AHDB at the moment is the Shape the Future vote, and I will encourage you all to get involved. And what that looks like, right now there is the opportunity to register, and what you're registering for is the opportunity to have your voice heard in the future of how your levy is spent. So you can visit the website ahdb.org.uk/shape-the-future. So what that timeline is registration opened on the 7th of December and it closes at the end of March. And at that point, on the 11th of April, there will be 4 weeks of voting available, but you need to have registered in order to be able to vote. So do make sure you've done that, and make sure that when the vote opens, you can make sure that your views are counted. And then in June, we look forward to seeing what the results are. A quick overview of what the registration portal looks like. It's a quick, easy form. You do need to register for all of the sectors that you are want to vote in. So, for example, you might want to register for both cereals and dairy. So you'd have to go through the form twice, but it is a very quick system, so you shouldn't throw up too many problems. There are a couple of other things going on that it's great to highlight to you all. So there is the online conference for crop production in Northern Britain conference on the 1st, 2nd of March. And that is open to everyone. And it's great that it's online because it gives much more opportunity for people to get involved. And also Arable Scotland is happening on Tuesday, the 5th of July in Dundee. So that's all what's coming up. But what we've got on today is a packed agenda. So it's quick fire updates is what we are looking at on IPM, soil, and all sorts of case studies. So with nothing further to say from me, we'll head over to Henry, who has prepared a short update. He will be joining for the panel session shortly, but we're going to hear from Henry on thinking outside the box on high-scoring IPM farms.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Henry Chryson, a Research Fellow in the Crop Protection team at SRUC in Edinburgh, and today I'm going to talk to you about the ways that we can measure IPM uptake and talk a bit about what those higher scoring IPM farms are doing and what we can learn from them. So this is the IPM process: prevention, then moving to detection, then what sort of interventions we can make, and then finally, crucially important, is that evaluation stage. So to facilitate that process, we've developed a tool, these IPM assessment plans, which are available on the Plant Health Centre website and also the NFU website if you're in England. And these tools can be used to facilitate a discussion between the farmer and the agronomist to develop IPM action plans. So by going through the short questionnaire that only takes 20-30 minutes to complete, you'll identify what you're currently doing and what potentially you could do to further increase IPM uptake on the farm, and then develop plans from there. It'll give you a baseline, so you get a score out of 100 in terms of overall IPM adoption. And this was a scoring system developed by expert opinion of about 50 agronomists and farmers and a few researchers as well. And so you can track your changes over time and hopefully take steps to try and improve your IPM score. It also identifies potential issues and topics requiring further research and development and knowledge transfer and exchange activity. So to date, we've had over 5,000 plans completed, the majority of them are being arable, which suggests that we need to do more to engage with the grassland sector, because it's a very important sector when talking about IPM. It's the biggest crop in the UK, and there are many issues associated with poor IPM practice that led to contamination of watercourses and things like that need to be considered. So we need to do more to engage with that sector when it comes to IPM. You'll see there's a good range in terms of IPM scores. So we feel like we're capturing a good the actual distribution of what people are doing and variation between farms there. You'll see there's a difference in terms of the means for arable and grassland, but these are not directly comparable because obviously the questions are slightly different and the weightings are as well, even though the same structure of the survey. So what are the differences now between the high and low adopters? So the red line shows the maximum score that they're able to get from answering that specific question. The lighter coloured bars indicate the top 25% of the farmers assessed by IPM score, and the darker grey, the bottom 25%. What you'll notice is that the top farmers are adopting many more preventative measures. So they're looking to reduce the introduction and spread of pests on farm. So those preventative measures may actually include use of pesticides as well. And they're also considering many more factors when planning for IPM and developing plans for the future. So thinking about changes in product efficacy, position and rotation, field history, all these sorts of things, cost-benefit analysis, taking a more holistic in terms of the farm, but also the farming business approach to IPM. IPM is a holistic process, looking to maximise profitability and productivity whilst minimising the negative impacts of production on the environment. So considering as many things as you can is going to lead to higher IPM adoption. We're looking at the grassland responses. Same sort of thing here in that we're seeing the higher adopters adopting many more preventative measures. They're also considering many more factors when developing and evaluating plans. But you'll see the expert opinion workshop awarded quite a high score to those factors that influence plans and development of IPM plans and evaluation of them. And those growers are still quite a way off there, in those top growers in terms of reaching that. So perhaps more emphasis on considering various other things that may influence weed populations and your control measures should be encouraged as we go down the line. Some other interesting findings that I suppose are less within our grasp in terms of able to influence is that we see an increase in IPM score with an increased arable area. Larger farms have higher IPM scores overall. You see there's a lot of variation there. but it was strongly significant. It could be that these larger farms have more ability to grow different crops, they've got more fields, more ability for rotation, different soil types, things like that, more ability to buy machinery and invest in decision support systems on farm, weather monitoring, things like that. But also they've potentially got more ability to buy an advice as well, or even have an on-farm agronomist, so on the payroll, which is allowing them to stay on top of the technical advances and make better IPM decisions to increase IPM score. This relationship was not seen when we looked at IPM score and the effect of grass area, either looking at overall grassland or the specific types of grassland. So there's no increase in IPM adoption as you increase the size of the farm when you're considering a livestock farm. One of the first questions we asked was, how familiar are you with IPM? So this was self-assessed, 1 to 5 scale, from not at all to very familiar. And what we found is that those that are deeming themselves to be more familiar with IPM are more likely to have a higher IPM score, greater adoption of IPM. And this makes sense because if you want to adopt an IPM practice, first you must upskill yourself, gather the information to inform that decision making. There's obviously a lot of variation around here, so just because you're familiar with IPM doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be adopted, because there could be various technological, economic, behavioural, market reasons that are preventing the higher IPM uptake. But it's good to see. So if you can take better steps and initiate programs to upskill farmers and also agronomists in terms of IPM, keeping everyone up to date, then we should hopefully see an increase in IPM uptake overall. When considering information source, we're looking at IPM score and which information sources are preferred by those higher adopters versus the lower. You'll see that higher adopters prefer information coming direct from research organisations or through levy boards and membership organisations. So those farmers that are seeking the up-to-date, current evidence-based independent advice are those that are typically having a higher IPM score. Also, those that are continually evaluating their control strategies and improving upon them year on year score higher, as do those that make use of an agronomist. And there's a slight tendency to prefer an independent agronomist for those higher adopting individuals as well. Down the other end, those that are putting a high value on farming press for IPM advice are typically scoring lower because there's not that exchange of information. It's just a passive way of receiving information rather than something that's much more active. We also asked about the relationship with their agronomists, and about half relied on their agronomists, their IPM advice. They've basically given that decision to the agronomist to be made, whereas the other half just work with the agronomist and decide on the IPM strategy together. And less than 1% didn't. So these IPM assessment plans can be used to assess overall IPM strategy, and that can be used as a tool to facilitate a discussion between the main decision makers on farm, typically the agronomist and the farmer, and allow for the creation of IPM action plans so that hopefully higher levels of IPM can be adopted in the future. Those higher adopters are considering many more factors when developing and evaluating IPM plans. They're adopting more preventative measures, and they're actively seeking IPM knowledge. So up to us to make sure that IPM advice is clear, consistent, and evidence-based. There's a lot of information on IPM put out there by those that have an agenda. We're looking to sell a product, whatever that may be. It's important that we can cut through that and present the clear, independent advice. We continue developing these sector-specific IPM plans. We've got the arable and the grassland one up and running on the Plant Health Centre website, and there'll be a specialist horticulture one hopefully coming with next month. Thank you for your time.
So as I said, Henry is going to be joining us for the panel discussion, and it'd be great if you've got any questions for them, pop them into the Q&A box and we'll make sure we ask them. But that was a great introduction to IPM uptake on farms. And we're going to keep moving, so we're going to pass over straight away to Julian Bell, who is going to talk about the journey to net zero and the arable priorities. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Michele. Morning, everyone. So I'm, excuse me, Julian Bell. So I'm responsible for SEC Consulting's carbon footprinting service, AgriCal. So today, it's a quick overview. I'll raise one or two general points that I did before, but what I wanted to home in on was, more the sort of overview, sort of strategy of things to think about essentially as a farming business, arable farming business, looking to sort of take on board the issue of moving to low carbon. What does that mean to the farm business? What are the pitfalls? What are the things to find out more about? And not really quite so much about the technical solutions, which we will look at or discuss a bit later on, but it's a bit more of that overall sort of strategy, business strategy. Excuse me. So, yeah, how do we decide, as an individual farm, how do we determine what our priorities are in this net zero world? Now, just to recap, other people are setting targets and priorities. So nationally, the government and bodies associated with them, and certainly for the UK, we've got the Committee on Climate Change as sort of kind of the overarching targets, I suppose, for farming to cut emissions. And when we get into Scotland, we've got the government here is obviously developing its own strategies, and which all tend to fit within that overall framework. And then we've also got individual supply chains. So whether you're supplying into the whiskey industry or supplying feed for, say, one of the livestock sectors, those chains are all responding. They are all developing their own strategies and their own targets. So this is quite a diverse environment, and to know how to respond is obviously not always quite that easy. And to be fair, a lot of these targets are continuing to evolve. So there is not total clarity on what's being expected. So the government, of course, they're saying all sectors have got to cut emissions. The economy's got to get to net zero by 2045 in Scotland, 2050 in the UK. Agriculture's got a share of that. Generally, the government aren't actually saying farming's got to get to net zero. It's just got to reduce its emissions and maybe offset that through other land uses, including soils, woodlands, and other peatland restoration, etc. So there are biological issues with farming. It's pretty well impossible to get to absolutely zero. So there is an acceptance of that. What is probably a wee bit more challenging is that some of the supply chains have gone further, or certainly have said they're going further, and on shorter timelines. And that is going to be more difficult to get to zero for some of the supply chains. So retailers have made various claims which tend to be ahead of the national ones. Of course, they may be something we have to deal with more urgently if that is a market we wish to enter into. A few very basic principles, obviously, with farming, cereal crops particularly, most of the emissions are associated in one shape or form with fertilizer and nutrients, whether it's production of fertilizer, the application of fertilizer or manures, and they're obviously soil carbon can be quite significant. So the profile is very much around nutrients, and the fuel is obviously there, but it's relatively a smaller element. So you can see the focus is there on fertilizer, managing manures and nutrients, and obviously managing the soil. So just that's the difference from livestock, where it tends to be things around ruminant production, methane, etc. And that's all. But also we've got to realise that farming is very much linked. It's part of an ecosystem, and feed is going into the livestock sector. So, and that can be a huge opportunity for cereals and for other combinable crops. A huge chunk, 70% of pig emissions are to do with the feed. How is that feed produced? And also a huge chunk of that is to do with soya, and poultry is even more. It's more like 80% for broilers. It's all to do with the feed. So the opportunity for the arable industry is to provide more protein and to work more effectively with the livestock sector. in terms of using those nutrients to displace fertilizer and bring the production, carbon production for feed down. So I think those linkages, which do happen on individual farms, but I think more collaboration across the livestock and crop sectors can actually help both sectors bring their emissions down. So that really could be quite a big opportunity. Sorry, getting wrong way. So just really to start summarising, in terms of business, it's a huge change going on. It's not very clear what going to next year is going to mean for everyone. So I think we're at the stage where everyone, so from a farming point of view, farm businesses start to identify what is going on, how might it affect me. It's sort of the question stage to some extent. How does my business compare with others? Am I at risk for certain things? Are there opportunities? Are there new markets opening up? Are there premiums for some of the products I'm growing? What the government scheme is going to require of me. There's a lot to be answered, and we are in that stage at the moment. But I think as you start moving down that state process, you've just got to know where you stand. So establish a carbon and a sort of related efficiency type of benchmark. You've got to know where you are, excuse me, so that you can know, what changes you might need to make, and if people are asking you targets, how difficult or easy might they be to make. So establish a baseline, select a credible, i.e. science-based practical tool. We've also got AgriCalc, but there's clearly many other tools available, and they all have different strengths and weaknesses. Clearly, it's got to meet the IPC science. It's got to have some industry acceptance, supply chain standard applied, like past 2050, for instance. It wants to provide you with benchmarking so that you can sort of see accurately where you are compared to others. It's got to meet your enterprise mix. The tools all vary a little bit in terms of how they serve different sectors. And at the end of the day, it's got to meet whatever your market requirement is stipulating as well. So quite a lot of factors there. And I know people say, well, the tools tend to give different results, and there's a bit of a variation amongst them. There are steps to sort of try and harmonise them, and AHDB are working on efforts there as well. But I think individually, it's your relative performance that's probably the most important thing. So if you are comfortable with using one tool, then sticking with that to give you an indication of where you're going and over the next 2 or 3 years or whatever is probably the most useful from a farming point of view. I'll just speed up a wee bit. This was a matrix. It's simply to show that once you start on mitigation, so establish baseline, try and improve what you're doing. There is a sort of hierarchy. You've got improving what you're doing on the farm. There usually things come out of the carbon audit, certain inefficiencies you aren't totally aware of or not quite so clearly established. 1 to 2 years, you can start to fine tune a few things there. You might spur you to think of new practices. Again, maybe a longer time scale needed. And as you go down this, all these steps, you start to potentially unlock bigger mitigation, bigger carbon reductions, but they'll equally take more time, start to need more capital, potentially add cost. So the start of this journey is reasonably feasible and practical. As the ask from the industry or the government increases to cut carbon more, it becomes much more involved. You may have to invest more money. Maybe there will be capital grants. There have been already in the government. Will there be some ongoing costs for inputs and things? You may have to put some land into sequestration, etc. These all start to have a bearing. How is that going to be paid for? So this whole process we've just begun will get more involved. And just really to summarise, we're going to have to try new things. We're always amazed or very interested in what farmers are doing already. We find different things that farmers are achieving already without having necessarily thought massively about this. And that knowledge can spread. We've got trials, innovation going on, of course, in other areas. I think at the farm level, it doesn't just start trying different things out. It's just half a field with a new practice. Maybe try a small block of livestock of breeding or something, bring in some new genetics, new varieties. Now's the time just to try small things. There are pilot schemes to try out some of the mechanisms for support, whether it's carbon or capital, natural capital. In Scotland, there's 1 or 2 pilots going on, and elsewhere. Just get on board, just see how that works. As I say, as time goes on, this will get more involved. But I think the sooner everyone just knows where they are and gets started, the easier it'll be to work at what's needed. Soil carbon sequestration, there's a big sort of expectation over this that it will have a role on most farms to improve and maximise carbon being locked up in soil. We're still at quite an early stage. There isn't a uniformity, there isn't acceptance of a standard. We need that to really move forward properly. So soil carbon code is really a necessity, and that is being worked on. So I think we're starting to get there. A bit like the carbon calculators, we need some standards across the board so you can get some consistency, and that will allow those carbon benefits to be applied commercially. And yeah, clearly we're getting into the realm of incentives for farmers really being needed to sort of drive this forward. And those schemes are starting to be piloted at the government level, and also in commercially, we're just starting to see a few premiums being put forward for certain things. It's pretty early days, and that will, as ever with farming, be the difficult part. Is negotiating, a necessary premium where it's needed to support this whole thing. But yeah, so I hope that's given you an overview of some of the business issues I think that might be needed to be thought about over the next few years. Thank you.
That's fab, Julian. Is there any sort of first steps that you would suggest farmers taking? I know fertilisers coming out as one of the big things for arable farmers, and equally with the price of fertiliser as it is at the moment, maybe we should be taking each prill and nearly looking at where every single one of them is. Is there something that you would recommend for all farmers to start thinking about straight away?
Well, I think it's a very common knowledge or information is actually one of the cheaper things to obtain. It's not free, of course. Sensors, precision equipment, soil sampling, there is a cost, but it's certainly, it's just looking at what else you can do to really understand what fertilizer you do need and whether that can be fine-tuned. And we actually find with a lot of crops, it's quite hard to avoid putting on a wee bit extra most of the time because you don't always know exactly, you don't want to go below what's needed. So again, it is fine tuning. And that is, although it's time and management required, you're not going to buy equipment and you are cutting input. So I think that sort of area is clearly much more important, especially with the high prices.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Julian. And you'll be back again for the panel session. So do carry on sending any questions that you've got for Julian as we go through. And I look forward to joining you again at that session. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it moves us swiftly on because we're now going to move over to Paul Hargreaves. He's going to talk about his top picks for healthy soil. And there's probably a lot of parallels in the carbon story and moving over to the soil story. So over to you, Paul. Oh.
I don't know if Paul's up on the call. Is he on, Michele?
I can't see him. I don't know whether anybody knows. Paul hasn't come on. So what we're going to do, so we're going to skip over Paul and we're going to head to Neil if you're there and happy to,
I'm here.
Take the bat on, Neil. You're not going to talk about soil, so I'll introduce, we're heading towards looking at what's in the IPM toolbox and what's available to farmers. So over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. I hope we can all see that screen shortly. Can you see that okay?
It's perfect, yep.
Okay. Okay, so as Michele said, I'm going to give you a kind of brief update on what's new in the IPM toolbox. And in terms of thinking about IPM, I mean, Henry's given a very eloquent definition of IPM. If we're thinking about IPM in terms of disease control, we're thinking about things like how we can prevent population of pathogens building up, suppress them, how we monitor things like non-chemical treatment methods, pesticide reduction, anti-resistance strategy, and use of other selective and specific pesticides. What I'm going to touch on in my talk is a bit about some of the new technologies which are coming to the forefront in terms of the IPM toolbox, and which can help us make more informed decisions, and also touch on some of the alternative methods and some of the work we've been doing to look at their potential efficacy going forward. Okay, so one of the things, if you've been following the advertisements in the trade or hearing some of the discussions and the presentations, the technology now exists. We've seen because of the COVID pandemic, we've seen the upgrading in terms of facilities for dealing with multiple molecular tests on a massive scale. And they always say agriculture is a poor relation of medicine, but again, here we're following on. But you'll have seen, so Bayer have introduced a rapid disease detection program. They've invited farmers to send in samples of wheat and barley to have them tested to quantify pathogen levels. There are also other companies, so Swift Detect have also been offering a similar service. And this potential to have a quantified amount of DNA results sent back to you within a couple of days of you posting off your samples in the post is a real step forward. So in the past, we would have been relying on potentially something like an ELISA in the field, but they're not as quantitative, so you wouldn't have come up with this figure. This is the first time we've really had this kind of technology close to hand and get these kind of figures. So obviously Bayer introduced theirs system, and the rationale behind it is to try and use this technology to better inform and adapt fungicide decisions. And we welcome that, and obviously it's great news, and it's great to have another tool. But just to say there are other few factors which can affect ultimately disease expression. And one of them is the varietal resistance. So some varietal resistance is not based solely on excluding the pathogen from the plant. Okay, sometimes it can be related to some of the other physiological processes which take place in the plant. So you can't always rely on that DNA. We know the plant nutrition that can have a big effect on things like rates of senescence. Julian's touched on nitrogen inputs in the previous talk. That's going to be an issue going forward. And we're all well aware the environmental conditions over the growing season can have a big drive and a big effect on the kind of levels of ultimately disease expression that we see. So things like the yellow rust and septoria you see in the pictures below that the Bayer system's been looking at, we know if the conditions which follow that detection level are not conducive to the pathogen, we might not see the levels of disease that we would have expected from having those DNA levels. So this information which can be derived is useful, but it needs to be combined with other factors when you think about ultimately what your input or your intervention is going to be. Okay, and we've got the picture there in the middle is ramularia as well, and we know how important the environment is in driving the disease levels in ramularia. Okay, so that's one of the things, new tools in the toolbox. Something else is obviously there's great interest in terms of new products to elicit defense response in the host plant or crops, and also biological. So we've been looking at a range of these as part of the RESAS government funding program for the last 5 years. We've been looking at incorporating them into programs. We're looking at one product in particular, laminarans, which is a brown seaweed derivative. We've been trying it in a number of programs. This is some work we did in winter barley in 2021. What you've roughly got is groups of 3 treatments. So you've got untreated, you've got low fungicide input, and then you've got what would be a more conventional fungicide program. So added on top of that, you've got either this elicitor as a seed treatment and as a T0 spray, just as a T0 spray, or just as a seed treatment. Okay. So we looked at a couple of varieties, mountain, higher yielding, but a bit more susceptible to the diseases, the major diseases, than, for example, surge. So if you look at these in groups of 3, 1, 2, 3, you can see that increase from using fungicides gives you that. The purple line is yield benefit. If you look at 4, 5, 6, you can see the yield benefit going up again. But look at 7, 8, 9, you're getting better response, excuse me, from the laminar as a T0 treatment and then reduced rate fungicide. You get the disease control and yield response, and likewise at 11, okay? So even one shot of the laminar and cutting back your fungicide to almost a quarter dose can give you almost a similar yield response to what you would see from a conventional program. Okay, so that was LG Mountain. If you look at Surge, you see roughly similar patterns again. And if you look at number 11 again, that's the laminarin, just as a seed treatment. But even one shot and reduced rate is able to give you that yield response. If you look at the difference compared to the control, you can see that's a significant increase in yield. And you need, obviously, thinking about the economics as well. If you're cutting your fungicide usage by half again from your conventional program, that more than meets the cost of the product, laminarin. So laminarin's not approved for barley at the moment. It is approved as a product in wheat, and the company is hoping to get that approved in barley shortly. We've looked again at a range of elicitors and other products as well in spring barley. So here we've got either untreated seed or laminarin treated seed, and then a range of different products at the T-naught spray timing. So some of them, you've got kayak there, obviously conventional fungicide, but you've got some other biostimulants which have been cited as having eliciting a defense response. You've got some other more well-known elicitors and some biologicals in there as well for comparison. And then again on top, you've got practically a quarter rate or a very low dose rate fungicide input. Okay. Again, we looked at two varieties, one non-MLO, so Propino grown more for feed, but we know it is mildew susceptible. What we didn't see in 2020 was much in the way of mildew. What we did see was net blotch, so that gave us some indication of disease levels. These are the coloured bars on the graph, and you can see how much net blotch there is in the untreated. So AUDPC is a level of the disease pressure over the growing season. So you can see the bars, and you look at the treatments, they've all given a significant reduction in the untreated seed with just the different T-naughts. If you look at the laminarin treated seed, again, you've got a reduction in terms of the disease levels, but you can see even having laminarin on your seed gives you a reduction in net blotch. The yellow line you'll see is the yield response. So again, what we're looking for is something to give that yield response. And here you can see the kayak, the conventional fungicide, and Phyta, one of the products that we looked at, has also got some given a yield response. If you look to the right, the graph on the right, what's quite interesting to see is the laminarin seed treatment followed by chitosan. This is another elicitor, which also helps strengthen cell walls to make the plant more resistant to pathogen attack. That's given the best yield response in the Propino. If you look at Laureate, we looked at Laureate, obviously an MLO variety, one of the high yielding varieties that we have at the moment. Again, we've seen a similar response. The kayak gave a good response with the untreated seed. And here, one of the biologicals gave a good response as well. Okay, that was quite interesting. If you look at the laminarin treated seed, you look at the laminarin treated seed, you can see we are seeing some yield response. It's quite interesting to see that, again, that pickup from the laminarin plus the chitosan. But here, none of the yield responses were actually significant. So if you look at the disease AUDPC on the y-axis, you can see in terms of disease pressure in the spring barley in 2021, it was very low. So that gives us some indication of what you might expect in a low disease year, but also indicates that the response from elicitors can be variable depending on disease pressure. The last thing I wanted to show you was something we've been looking at in terms of ramularia control. We know there's big issues in ramularia control. It's really difficult to control it now. We've lost chlorothalonil. So what other products might be used? So here we've looked at a range of elicitors and other biostimulants as two applications to see how they would give, what kind of response they give in terms of ramularia control. And the product sheet you'll have seen, in the previous slide. So Omex is potassium carbonate, Zynergy is copper, zinc, and sulfate. Sulfomex is nitrogen and sulfur. Kelpac is giant brown seaweed. Phytophosphate is phosphite, which is supposed to elicit defense response. DP98 is fully soluble phosphorus. Copper is Headland copper, which has a dual role as a fertilizer and a fungicide. Microthiol is just different formulations with sulfur. And the amino flow, that's a natural amino acid product. Okay, when we looked at them in 2021, you can see the red line is the yield response, the blue bars are percentage ramularia. You can see on the graph on the left, we've not seen much in terms of ramularia control. The only significant control came from the Synergy and the copper. The yield response, copper gave a good yield response. If you look to the right, you'll see the amino flow, 2.5 litres of that applied did give a significant yield response. And when we looked at the characteristics of yield, what components, we looked at the specific weight. You can see in the graph on the right, this is the blue bars, is a specific weight, so not a significant increase from the amino flow. So it suggests that the yield response we are seeing may be related to the survival of more tillers, but it doesn't necessarily correspond to bigger grains coming through in the crop. So that's just some of the research we've been doing, looking at alternatives to conventionals, and we'll be carrying that on in future years. So I'd just like to acknowledge the funding from Scottish Government RESAS programme and also the Means of Lauriston Trust Fund for the work on ramularia. And look forward to any questions you may have in the question and answer session. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Neil. Thank you ever so much for that. Really interesting looking at the option of the alternative products, where they could fit potentially into the IPM programme. So thank you for that. We'll look forward to seeing you later for the panel session. But for now, we're going to move over to Robin Walker, who's going to look at how we can maximise the benefits from cover crops. So over to you, Robin.
Hello, can you hear me and can you see the screen?
Sure can.
Yeah. Excellent. So I've been asked to talk briefly about cover crops and green manures. Some of it will be a kind of introduction or just kind of a general kind of summary of what they are. And then there'll be a little bit of work that myself and colleagues, particularly John Badley, have been involved in, and then a rounding up of that. So if we look at cover crops and green manures, there's lots of kind of terminology that seems to get intertwined a little bit. But cover crops really are grown over a single winter period and primarily used to cover the bare soil or stubbles left by the previous crop. Cover crops are not usually harvested like a cash crop, and you would typically destroy them in some way before you put in the next crop. So with a herbicide, you may be rolling or crimping in some way, ploughing or cultivation, if not ploughing. And it may be that you're actually utilising frost to knock out the cover crop as well. So some crops or species are going to be more susceptible before putting in the new crop. If you look at a green manure, well, it is a type of a cover crop, and typically it would be grown for a longer period of time, like a whole cropping year. And quite often, or in many cases actually, the green manures would include legume species of some kind, if not several, to enable nitrogen fixation as well as a whole raft of other benefits that you'd be looking for. But the green manure will be typically incorporated in the field while still green, and there's a link here to kind of definitions within the Scottish Government if you want to look into that in more depth. For this particular presentation, I kind of focus more on the nitrogen fixing crop angle because that's where most of the work that we've done has been involved in. But as it says at the top here, I'm assuming you can see the pointer, mixing legumes with other species is certainly help with an awful lot of other things, not necessarily just growing them on their own. One of the key things we'll be looking at would be things like soil organic matter retention or increase. So if your soil organic matter is already high, you don't want that to drop. If your soil organic levels are fairly low, then obviously you want to try and increase that for a whole raft of reasons, some of which have already been mentioned in other talks. A big aspect would also be soil structure improvement, and that kind of links into water relations as well as nutrient use efficiency. And it's not just nitrogen, it's other nutrients as well. You could be looking at a long-term lay. I've established for more than 1 year. So if you can look at the background, sort of the shaded background here, this is one of our diverse herbal lay mixtures. So there's loads of grass and various clovers, but there's things like chicory, plantain, yarrow and stuff like that in there as well. And again, looking at nitrogen fixation and organic matter buildup. You could be looking at overwintering, so sown in the autumn, obviously there's a limitation there in terms of Scotland just because of the weather and the cold season, but there are things which can grow and will grow. Primarily looking to minimise nitrogen leaching, but again, you can use legumes in there. And then you could be looking at a summer, so growing for the whole season, April through to September, but possibly through into the following spring. And again, looking for a nitrogen boost from any legumes in there. And again, linked to kind of what Julian was saying about trying to kind of link arable and livestock enterprises, there could be kind of scope there for getting some grazing on your arable land to extend the period that these are in. And then there's things like intercropping systems. So you may be using a cereal that's undersown with your grass clover to get into a lay phase, a grassland phase. And again, it can help with weed control to some extent. In terms of one of the trials that so my colleague John Badley had been involved with, we looked at a number of different mixtures. So we had 5 3-way mixtures, this A, B, C, D, which will come on to some of the following trials. And there are also individual species in there. So if you see the term LU, that's lucerne, red clover, white clover is WC, etc., etc. And then there are a mixture of grain legumes as well. So we've got forage legumes and grain legumes, which we had either grown alone or in mixtures. And then we followed those, looking at the kind of impact. It wouldn't have been just nitrogen fixation, it would have been some of the other aspects we looked at as well in terms of soil structure, overlaid on those sites and looked at the improvements. If we looked at the biomass in the summer of those, the red ones here are the component mixtures, and these C and D at the top end here are the white clover, vetch and pea, or the white clover, vetch and beans. So basically they've got the grain legumes in here. If we go down the bottom here, this kind of purple one, this is the grass, rye clover, ryegrass and clover on its own. BM is black medic, so they were fairly kind of poor, and then we've got other ones in there. But the red ones, which are these component mixtures, generally speaking, the biomass was towards the upper end of what was being produced. And then we grew the spring barley on top of these afterwards, and this is what we got. So again, there's kind of a colour coding. So the ryegrass was the background one, as was the spring barley. So we kind of got 2 controls, and then we've got the various individual species in terms of the blues. So the grain legume species, so beans, lupins, peas, vetch. The green ones were the forage legume species, and the red ones were the mixtures again. And you can see as we kind of head along here, generally speaking, the forage legume species had been producing greater spring barley in the following year, and the mixtures were also towards the upper end of that. There's quite a big difference between sort of 3-4 tonnes per hectare when those nitrogen was applied previous year to those crops, as opposed to kind of 6 or 7 tonnes per hectare. So there's a reasonable difference there. If we're looking at a cover crop, so an overwinter cover crop, the one that we'd had more success with of growing was the larger seeded kind of rye vetch cover crops. So these have been established in autumn a few years ago. And the kind of seed rates are here, but we were looking at 2 different ratios really of the rye and vetch. So 60%, 40% of the kind of the seed rates, or 80 and 20%. So we tended to have more rye to use to try and support the vetch. You can see here is a big mass of vetch, which has tended to kind of pull the crop down. So we tended to have a higher proportion of vetch in the mixture. And this was repeated over 2 seasons. No nitrogen was applied, but there had been some base P and K. And we were looking at multifunctionality of that. So we were looking at growing ploughing it in the spring, and putting in a spring barley trial, or we were looking at following through for silage, but potentially grazing as well. So we're looking at the follow over in the spring. This was the barley that was grown, and there was no real difference shown here. If anything, the rye and vetch mixes tended to kind of be ever so slightly suppressed, although they weren't significantly different. And that could have been due to kind of the timing of incorporation, potential little bit of allelopathic effect from the rye, as well as not enough time for kind of mineralization to take effect. Whereas the vetch on its own wasn't too bad. So there wasn't a big difference in terms of that, whereas in the previous set of results from the other legumes that I showed, there was quite some big differences. What we did do, as I said, was follow this on through to silage. So potentially you might be able to kind of integrate with a livestock farm nearby. So this was kind of late summer, these were taken. So the yield, bearing in mind there was no nitrogen, was pretty substantial for the mixtures. So the rye 60%, vetch 40%, and the other rye 80 and 20. In terms of energy production, again, the two mixtures were pretty significantly higher. And if we move on to crude protein as a percentage, as you'd expect, the vetch being the legume was high and the rye was less. But when you kind of combine that in terms of the yield and got a protein yield from that, again, the rye and the vetch mixtures were significantly higher. So there's ways of looking at how you can integrate these into your system for maybe a longer period of time if you can match up with a livestock enterprise if you haven't got livestock on your own farm. Looking at how you would go about choosing your mixtures, you may or may not have come across this, but this is it's on a website. It was linked to a project from Oscar from a while back, but it's been moved forward. But what it does do is give you lots of information about how you might choose species to match certain requirements. So here, for example, we've got biomass, nitrogen supply, disease suppression, adaptation to sandy soils or to heavy soils. Are you trying to get soil stabilization? Are you looking at it specifically as a cover crop or as a living mulch, whole season crop? And you're looking at important, less important, or not relevant in these situations. Another one here for weed suppression or disease suppression. So there's a whole range of things. Nitrogen supplyability as well, if you're looking at a legume component. And you can go in, you can kind of click on these different searches. You can indicate what kind of soil pH range you're kind of looking at growing in, submit the search, and it'll come up with a big list of species which may be appropriate, which you could include in a mix. Obviously, there are ready-made mixes. This happens to be from Cotswold Seeds, but there's obviously loads of other seed companies that will produce seed mixes, some of which have been tested in Scotland, some haven't. The reason I put the Cotswold Seed catalogue on, the online catalogue, again, there's a link here, is really, really useful information about all the individual species. And here it's quite clear, you're looking at different rooting depths and things like that. But the individual amounts that are in there or information in there can give you a lot of useful information about what you may or may not include in a mix for your cover crop or green manure. So in summary, this is a kind of a general summary from some of the things I've just said, but beyond that as well, from other people's experiences. You're trying to kind and include these kind of things in more than one place in the rotation if possible, because you're not going to get a one-hit wonder. If your soil organic matter is 2%, you're not going to suddenly just jump up to like 4% in a year just by having one of these crops in there. So you're looking to see if you can integrate it at various points in the rotation. Attention to detail as well. So you need to choose your crop species wisely. So some of the previous slides kind of tie in with that a little bit about how you might go about choosing crops to match your desired objectives. So again, is it really for soil organic matter? Is it for improved soil structure, whatever it happens to be? And also, if you, depending on what else you've got in the rotation, for example, if you've got oilseed rape in your rotation, you'd want to be restricting the amount of brassicas that you have in the mix to reduce clubroot, etc. Then you've got to think about termination of the cover crop or green manure. How are you going to do that? As I said before, things like rye could be problematic if you don't leave sufficient time to break down. You don't want to impact negatively on the crop that's following, on the succeeding crop. And then you've also got things like influence of herbicides. So obviously you've used herbicides on the crop prior to your green manure. You want to make sure it's not going to impact on the species that are in there. It might actually be advantageous in some cases, but you need to be a bit aware of that you're not going to knock out the cover crop that you've sown from herbicide residues. And again, particularly in terms of Scotland, just being aware of planting too late in the autumn if you're looking at an overwinter one. Small seeded species tend to succeed less in Scotland, which is part of the reason we focused on the rye and vetch, because we knew they grew quite well. The smaller seeded species, unless you're in really good conditions, of course, you can't predict what the weather's going to do, they're definitely a little bit more hit and miss. So you do need to kind of really think about that, and also how you're actually going to put them in the ground. So a lot of people would try and limit the amount of cultivation that they're doing to put that in and use kind of kit designed for that. And it may well be that we hear about more of that from some of the case study farms that are going to be talking in the next few talks. So thank you very much for your attention. And these are the various people who'd been involved in funding some of the work that I've just spoken about. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Robin, for that nice overview of cover crops. I have had one question come in that it'd be great to just discuss before we move on, which is just about the trial and how the cover crops were destructed. How was it done? Was it through herbicide use or? No,
they were topped and then they were basically ploughed in. So in an ideal world, we would have had less invasive cultivation, but we didn't have kit that was the right size to fit the plot, so that we used what we had basically.
Brilliant. That's completely understandable, but great to understand how it was done. So we're going to keep going. I am pleased to tell you that we are going to loop back to Paul, but before we do that, we're going to hear from case study number 1. We're going to look at championing of IPM, and I'm pleased to be joined by Alan Grant from Skillimano Farm in Aberdeenshire. So over to you, Alan.
Hello there. Yeah, hope you can hear me here. Yeah.
Hello. See you.
Thank you. Neil asked me to do a wee bit on IPM, so here are some of my thoughts, what I've tried and where we go from here. What I'd like to say for a start is, guys, we've got to be careful as grain prices continue to rise, grain stocks go down and demand rises. Just remember, our job is to produce food. Okay, so just be careful here. So my aim is to go from soil right to harvest. So Kirsten, can we have a slide on, please? Hello?
You might be trying to sort out Paul's slides at the moment. We'll go.
Okay, I think we've got some slides, have we?
They're coming. Yeah, perfect.
Coming. Have we got the next slide? Yeah, here we go. Okay, so soil health. Well, I've been doing GPS sampling and spreading now for over 20 years, and I'm building up a picture of what is happening. So this must be used rather than just having it as nice wallpaper in the office. But being asked to do this presentation made me look back at my old soil samples over the last 20 years. And with all the talk of depleting the soil of nutrients, it made me look up my organic matter levels to find that over this time, my samples have actually risen from below 5 to 8.4, 8.7, and some are now even at 14.7. So I've nothing now below 6. I'll follow this up with a full health report, which is now ongoing. So next slide, please, Kirsten. Rotation. Well, basically, I rotate crops around a 4-year crop, 4-year rotation. So winter barley, oilseed rape, winter wheat, and spring barley. So this is very important for IPM, and I'll cover that later as we go along. Next slide, please. Cultivation. Well, although still mainly plough-based at the moment, I have tried the Amazon system of Nuttall, the Claydon system of direct drill and no-till in rape and cereals. But just remember that unburied trash can lead to higher levels of disease inoculum, so be careful there. Varieties, something very basic really, but nevertheless very important. You must choose for the end market. But disease resistance is now the #1 factor, especially that we've now lost chlorothalonil. Okay. Next slide, please, Kirsten. Fertilizer reduction. With GPS sampling, the P&K is now evened out in the farm. So I no longer buy just the basic 777s or 5-24-24 or 0-24-24 type fertilizer. The P&K is all matched to crop removal, whether it's for cereals or rape, or if the straw is baled or choked. So the nitrogen is all liquid now, and with the accuracy, the right amount is put in the right place. And with the auto section control on the sprayer, it's just changed the thing altogether. One of the best changes that I've made in recent years, really. Farmyard manure and poultry muck is put onto winter barley stubbles for oilseed rape to get big established plants in the springtime, so they've got a good GAI, green area index, so that'll help reduce the nitrogen requirement in the spring. When the oilseed rape straw is chopped, and any excess nitrogen will help break it down. There's a lot of talk going on just now about BER, the break-even ratio. 5 seems to be the figure that a lot of people are going, but I've done my sums and being quite realistic and average here really. If wheat is £225 next harvest and your nitrogen is bought, well, I was lucky enough to buy some at 300, but some at 6 as well. So an average of 450. My sums tell me that no adjustment is needed. Okay. And indeed, if oilseed rape is over, say, £600, I can even add a little extra nitrogen. So just remember, guys, that fertilizer is the engine that powers your crops. Okay. So if you look after it, it will look after your carbon footprint as well. So you only apply what is actually needed and where. Next slide, please, Kirsten. Herbicides. No scorched earth policy now. Okay, when we started growing winter crops, we had to have scorched earth, but so the autumn sown crops get a pre-emergence mainly for grass weeds. And a few broadleaf weeds are still there in the spring, but they're not too damaging. Okay, so I try to map in my head where I need to spot treat the odd bit of fumitory, mayweed, shepherd's purse, or whatever. But I also now have the ability in my sprayer to plot points, for example, wild oats, and go back and treat them. Okay, so I no longer use pre-harvest Roundup on wheat. I leave the stubbles with a little bit of green for birds and insects over the winter. Insecticides, they're dramatically reduced in the farm. No chlorpyrifos for leather jackets. Isn't it amazing how we just seem to manage without it? No methiacarb, no metaldehyde for slugs. So we're only using ferrous phosphate. And I've now stopped 2 mid-flower sprays in the oilseed rape for pollen, beetle, and seed weevil, as long as threshold. But it is important to constantly monitor crops. As a cabbage stem flea beetle nearly caught us out this year. But we must be aware of resistance as our neighbours down south have found out. And biostimulants there, well, throughout the year I do tissue analysis. I have done grain analysis to see which trace elements are needed. This may be a better bet maybe than using a lot of fungicides. Over the last couple of years, I've been trying lots of different bioscience products like Terrasorb amino acids, chlorophyll for the biological grain fill, T6P, which enhances the metabolic development naturally. So biostimulants help build up root mass and help nutrient uptake, which makes this expensive nitrogen that we're using more efficient. But again, the jury is out in that one. Next slide, please, Kirsten. As far as companion crops and cover crops go, I have grown Berseem clover as a companion crop in oilseed rape to help regulate the nitrogen use. But as far as cover crops grow, I haven't tried them myself, but I've been to several sites to see them growing Phacelia and black oats and so on. But the problem where I am in the northeast of Scotland is getting them in early enough after spring barley and wheat is difficult. A customer of mine that I do all the spraying on his farm has done a mix of spring barley, winter barley and oats sown behind the combine. And I actually walked over it with him last week, and the spring barley was the best. The oats was the worst, but he put that down to the date of sowing the oats. They were just too late. Okay, but the best of it was sort of half up my wellies and was blowing down nicely. So very cheap, established, and he only used farm safe seed. Another neighbour, he has sown rape into growing crops of spring barley. Although very patchy, but I think that was because of the dry. There's lots of vegetation to plough in. So again, just a case of watch this space. What I will say is, if you're growing rape in the farm, be very careful with radish, mustard, vetches, and then weeds like charlock, shepherd's purse, and so on with clubroot. So be careful with that one. Next slide, please, Kirsten. IPM plan, what's been spoken about today already. My whole farm now has water margins, grass margins, and so on around the fields for the beneficials. And I am actually seeing more butterflies and ladybirds, etc. But I would say a good IPM plan needs 4 critical things: time, patience, energy, and planning. So at this point, I would like to mention the Scottish IPM plan that can be done online. We've spoken about earlier, and I think it's very good, as it gives you your score for your farm. Okay, so as it was said, it's a scale of nothing to 100. So if you do it annually, and you're honest, okay, you can track your progress and get improvement suggestions at the end. Okay, so this may be the thing that could help the industry demonstrate good practice and help us maybe retain some of the active ingredients that we're losing. I noticed on his slides the average for Scotland was about 65. Well, I'll be honest and say that I got 60. So you don't necessarily need a high score. I think you learn from it. Okay, next slide, please. Challenges ahead. Well, where do I start here? Brexit, net zero, environmental pressure, logistics, availability of products, diminishing subsidies, diminishing active ingredients. There's a whole list I noted down there. But food security is another one, and I can see other countries protecting their food sources and not exporting fertilizer in the future. So I think we need to be careful there. So for the future, well, I would say you definitely need to use a basis of facts advisor, as they are going through so much training at the moment with carbon audits, soil health, so on and so on. But remember, guys, that soil health is nothing new, okay? Farmers looked after the soil long before the government took any interest in it. Not only is every farm different, every field's different. My father taught me that. My grandfather taught me that. My great-grandfather probably taught him that. So, okay, we've looked after the soil. There's nothing new there. Okay, so to finish off, I would like to use one word, and the word being sustainable, that we hear all the time. But just remember, as well as looking after the environment, like where I started, we're still producing food. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was a great last word to think about, and I think it actually chimes with everything we're doing. And if we think back to the title of this webinar, it is Growing a Sustainable Future, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there. So we'll come back to you, and I look forward to chatting with you in the panel session at the end. But we're going to move nicely on, and I'm glad you mentioned soil at the end as well, because we are going to pick up with Paul Hargreaves, who is going to talk to us about the top picks for a healthy soil. So Paul, if you can join us, and we'll head over to you.
Yeah, thank you. If you can put the slides up, that would be great. Yeah, my name's Paul Hargreaves. I work at the Dairy Research and Innovation Centre at SRUC down in Dumfries. My background is in soils and soils research, but I really tried to think about the more practical aspects of that, and we do employ these things on the farm down at in Dumfries. So I just thought today we'd just walk through some of the changes in soil and ideas about soil and soil health, and some of the things that we can be thinking about that's picked out with the new methods that AHDB are promoting of a kind of soil health card. So go on to the next slide, please. I was just thinking about the principles of soil quality. We've moved on really from thinking of soil and the chemicals and just the nutrients in soil. I know the previous speaker said soil health's important and it's the basis of what we do, and keeping your soils healthier is as important as possible. But I think it's worth just thinking of these in three main areas. In the past, a lot of emphasis has been on the nutrients, and they are important, the fertilizers you add to the field. But some people, I think, got into a very kind of linear mindset where we add the nutrients, we plant the seed, we grow the crops, we harvest them, then we go through that cycle again. And really, we need to start thinking about this idea of sustainability and what are the aspects of the soil that we can think about, which has also got potentially benefits for the environment and also elements of carbon sequestration as well. So if you just go through these, if you can press the button again, please. If you think about soil texture and knowing, it's important to know what, as the previous speaker just said, know the texture of your field, know what kind of soils you're dealing with within fields or within different fields on the farm, so you can adjust and think about how you deal with the management of those soils. If you've got sandy fields against heavier clay fields, then the activities, the timing of that can be different depending on the soil texture you've got there. So this affects the workability, the trafficability, and potential damage that you can cause to those fields in different conditions. So think about the soil structure, and we'll go through and see how you can assess that in a later slide. But thinking about the soil structure is the gaps between the physical pieces of soil that you're thinking about as well. This allows air into the soil, it allows water to drain through, and allows the microbial population, the bugs in the soil, to perform the most efficiently, so they can then turn over the nutrients that have been added to the soil to make them available to the crops to grow. And again, we're thinking about the water balance and drainage. If you can press the button again, please. And now we come to thinking about the chemical aspects of it. And it's not just the nutrients that you're adding, it's about thinking about the pH and the optimum pH for the crops that you're growing. And so we can try and also think about when you add the nutrients to the crop and making sure that the right amount is there at the right place at the right time, so not wasting some of this now very valuable resource. Once again, please. And this leads us on to the biological aspects, thinking about the organisms within the soil, what they do, how they help to regulate and promote the turnover of nutrients to make them available to the crop to try and enhance and maximize your crop yield. Thinking about when you have to move the soil and the amount of tillage you do, and also has been said already about cover crops and intercropping, this kind of diversity of crops in time and space. Next slide, please. And this is just a mock-up of a scorecard that I've done for an example here. We've got different bands with different traffic lights system to show when, for an arable field or for a grassland field, that the levels that you're measuring or you're assessing there are either good, we were happy with that, we just need to continue monitoring that every so often, or if it's heading down a slope towards being poor, affecting the soil quality, that we need to review that more often, or try and think of a management plan that will help bring that up to into the green band. And if it's
Hi,
red,
Paul. Sorry,
yes,
I'm just going to pause there. I don't know whether there might be somebody that isn't muted in the panel group. If all panelists could make sure they're muted, please. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
All right, no, sorry about that. That's okay. But if they got to, if they get into a red, then basically we need to think about how we're going to improve that and what management we can bring in to help improve that component of the soil. And here we can see that arable field 1 is in probably a good state of soil quality. We need to be thinking about some of the nutrients that we're adding there, the P, the potash, the magnesium, to bring those up to green. But hopefully if we're catching at this point, we're not going to be adding large amounts of those to the soil, and it's just mainly top dressings. In field 2, there is some concerns about some of the nutrients, but what we're thinking there is that there's problems with the soil structure. This can be leading to reductions in yield, and so this is also backed up by the earthworm numbers, and we're using earthworms as a proxy for the soil biology itself. So we've seen low earthworm numbers, we're expecting low activity within the soil as well. So what we're saying there as well is some of these nutrients that we're putting on aren't being made available to the growing plant. So they can be lost from the system, leached out of the system, not used, and we're adding those and not seeing any benefit for it. And with the grassland system, there's a problem there, definitely with the pH. We need to bring that up through liming. There's a potentially a problem, or need to think about the potash levels there. The soil structure is something that we need to look at and see if we can change the management there to try and improve the soil structure and stop it getting any worse. And this potentially is reflected in the earthworm numbers, low earthworm numbers. We expect a lot more earthworms in a grassland field than we would do in an arable field. So in this situation, there's something there that's constraining the numbers of earthworms. Either the soil structure is starting to have an effect, or potentially more likely the reduction in pH is also reducing earthworm numbers. So again, this is showing that the biological activity isn't working as efficiently as it can do. Next slide, please. And just to remind people that we've known a lot about the soil chemistry. There's a lot of information out there. There's Farm Advisory Service technical sheets about this. And basically what we're trying to do is get an optimum pH through liming to ensure that we're getting the maximum amount of the main nutrients that we need, including nitrogen, but phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, all those are when we think about a pH of 6.2 for grassland or 6.4 for arable as a rule of thumb. This is where we've seen these elements being used there most efficiently, so we're not wasting fertilizer that we're applying to these crops. Next slide, please. If you press it 3 or 4 times, it should come in from the side. And we're just thinking about soil structure now. And these are how the particles of soil are bound together and how they hold together. It's important that we have some structure to the soil because this helps anchor the plants and to the soil and the roots. But we need the gaps and the pores between the soil particles to allow water to move and to drain through the soil. However, we don't want the gaps to be so large that the water just runs straight through, so we need some kind of structure there with smaller pores to allow the water to be retained within the soil. And also we need air, oxygen to get into the soil to allow the roots to grow, but also the soil microbial population, the bugs in the soil, are most effective when they're when they've got a good supply of oxygen. If we get waterlogging, if we get standing water within the soil profile, then we turn into anaerobic conditions. The oxygen's not getting in there. We get very poor turnover of nutrients, and those nutrients aren't then available to the crop, and we see poor crop growth. So it's important that we get this drainage right and allow oxygen into the soil. Next slide, please. And this is just one way. This has been developed and promoted by SRUC, a way of encouraging yourselves, consultants, farmers, agronomists, to go into the field and dig a block of soil out, to try and open that block out to see what the structure's like. And this is some instructions here how to do that, when to do that, generally in the spring or autumn. After crops come out, we can see what damage has been done, and we can see what, then we can start putting management into place to try and resolve that, any problems there. You can press the button again, and this is on the back side of this card here. It gives you a lot of information about what's a good soil structure. So SQ1 along the top is in green. It's showing a good soil structure. I mean, but hopefully people would recognize that as they pull it apart. It's the small rounded soil fragments, the ones that you want to see. The soil should have a good earthy smell to it as well, and plenty of roots and root growth. As it gets poorer soil structure, the aggregate sizes get larger, they get more angular in shape, showing that they've been forced and compressed together. There's less gaps between them. The roots struggle to grow through the aggregates. You're getting less big pores that you can see there, so this is affecting the drainage. And if you're getting down to the bottom line there, you're getting very large platy material that's been compacted together with little gaps between them. Very difficult for the roots to grow through that. It can change colour. It can stop being a blackish, brownish earth soil kind of colour, what you would expect, and you can start to see this grey coloration. Sometimes you can get a very poor smell from it, a kind of bad egg smell, showing that the microbial population there have changed from these effective, efficient oxygen microbes to inefficient anaerobic microbes, and this is what's causing these this bad smell. If you're getting down to those kind of levels, if you're seeing parts of your field with those kind of soil structures, then you really need to start thinking about how you're going to address that and putting in some management to alleviate that kind of problem. Next slide, please. Just to mention about earthworms. Earthworms are useful, as I said. They're a proxy for other microorganisms and biology within the soil. They're a good indicator because they prefer soil conditions similar to good crop growth. They like it when there's they have larger numbers when the soil's been in no tillage or reduced tillage, so hence why we get larger numbers in grassland systems than we do in arable systems. They don't like compaction. We've seen this in experiments that we've done down at the farm in Dumfries, where we get either reduced earthworm numbers or we get less adult earthworms in compacted systems, or where the soil's been compacted. They don't like acidic soil, so they can be an indicator that you need to lime your soil if you've seen less earthworms. And they like aerated soils. They don't like waterlogged soils. So again, it's an indication that there's a problem there, and what can we start to think about management-wise to do about that. Next slide, please. And so I'm just trying to put in summary here what we're thinking about, what we can do to enhance our soil quality. If you're thinking about the nutrients that you're applying. Don't forget that lime is also important to make sure those nutrients are available at the most efficient rates that you're applying them. So the pH and having a pH test of your soil is really important. And as the previous speaker said, think about what nutrients the crop that you're growing needs, what's been taken off by previous crops. And again, with soil analysis can show you where there might be deficiencies in certain nutrients, especially the major nutrients like P and K. Soil structural problems. Compaction is something that can occur very quickly. We've seen in our research and in other research that the first pass of a heavy tractor in the wrong conditions, in wet conditions on the field, can cause 70% of the damage that you're going to see through compaction on that field. So it can happen just with one pass of your tractor. So it's important we think about this. If you think that you've damaged your soils, it's worth going out, digging a block of soil out and assessing what the state of the structure of that soil is. So the FAS assessment is very useful there, and it probably takes more time than cost as far as a spade and looking at the block of soil as you pull it out. And again, photographing that, thinking about that. If you're not sure if there has been damage there, then go and compare it with a block of soil from part of the field where you know there's not been any damage, to compare and contrast there to see what the differences are. And the earthworm numbers, again, are a good indication of the biological activity. There's banding for earthworms that are suitable for Scotland that are coming out through AHDB, but these aren't a be-all and end-all of it. If you've not got any earthworms, you're not finding any earthworms, then there's some problem there you need to address. If you've found 10 earthworms in an arable site, then that's very good. If you're only finding 10 earthworms in a grassland site, that's probably not quite as good, but at least you're finding some earthworms there. There's some kind of activity going there, so try and promote what they like, really. And this just brings us on right at the end to soil organic matter, just to stress the importance of this. The two previous speakers have mentioned this. Robin was mentioning this as far as cover crops are concerned and putting organic matter into the soil. This is important. It helps bind the soil together, but it also helps maintain gaps between the soil as well. If you can think of it as like pieces of sponge within the soil, that it allows water to drain through it, but it does retain some of that moisture. So if we're seeing changes in climate, if we're seeing drier summers, then soils that contain more organic matter will hold on to the moisture for longer, allowing the crop to grow for a longer period of time. So organic matter is so important in what we do as far as maintaining soil quality is concerned. Plus that you're hopefully trying to maintain soil carbon within the soil as well. So there's that carbon sequestration aspect of it. And also these are areas where the soil biology is most active around soil organic matter particles. So these are important sites for maintaining the soil biology within the soil itself. And I think next slide, please. And this is just a list of some of the people who've been involved in the Healthy Soils programme, the Great Soils programme for AHDB, SRUC being one of those. And there's plenty of resources if you go onto the AHDB Great Soils website. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Paul, for that excellent overview of soil health. And I look forward to you joining us for the panel session later. Do carry on sending in any questions for any of our speakers, including Paul, into that Q&A box at the bottom. And we'll move nicely on to our next speaker, who's going to talk about the incremental gains he's made in farming practice. And it's Dave Bell from Fairfield Farms in Fife. So over to you, Dave.
Good morning. And I suppose it's fortunate that I'm running last tonight and this morning, and we're running out of time. So I'll just crack on and spare you some duplication of what we've got coming up. So hopefully you'll see my screen being shared. If someone would give me a nod or a yes.
Can't see the screen yet.
Okay, folks. Try this one then. That one?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great stuff. Thanks very much. So yeah, morning. So I'm a mixed farmer here in East Fife with own farm, secure tenancy, contract farming, with cereals, grass, beef suckler herd, potatoes, and environmental areas. So a full mix of mixed farming, different enterprises, and try and make a decent job of what we can. So what I did first, you've got to sort out, as been mentioned, sort out your pHs. So everything on the farm is nutrient mapped. So we've sorted out our pHs, and fortunately, it's looking a lot better than it used to. There's still, obviously, you can see three little red areas which are needing attention, but generally we're looking pretty good. And as Paul's mentioned it as well, the pH is obviously can reduce or the availability of certain nutrients, so that's why we do it. And there's always a limiting factor to yield, to producing produce, and it's just understanding those limiting factors and trying balance the requirements of plants, etc. So yeah, with that, we're putting money onto the farm, so you need to make sure you get your return on investment. So balancing your pH is a really simple way of making sure you're getting your money back from putting expensive commodities and inputs onto your crops. So we damage the soils. Quite open with that one. These three harvesting jobs were all done on the same day, which was quite a nice variety. But you know, arguably your cereal production is the least damaging. Potatoes and vining peas can be fairly challenging and damaging. But you know, are we doing irreparable damage? Who knows? But well, we do know, but we've got to make money, and you know, best practice is great, but we've still got to be profitable, and having a varied rotation allows us to be profitable and let things happen. So yeah, we need these larger machines to take the crops off as break crops as well, which and then in turn helps the farm margin having break crops amongst them. We put back though, so we add to the soil, we don't just take away. So we're using FYM, our own FYM from the cattle. We have straw from muck agreements. We're trying to use as much bulky organic fertilizers as I can get my hands on, from FYM, chicken litter, fiber FOS and composts, almost a bit of a carbon whore, but open to anything that can come on. Obviously aware that that can come with its own challenges with IPM, with disease, pests, weeds to combat that you import onto your farm. But it's part of the cycle of little gains here and there and adding to it constantly rather than just once and again. There's never a black and white answer. There's compromises to be made. And that's the thing with good practice and IPM, that there's everyone's farm is different, and we all have different abilities we can do with our ground, and it's using the appropriate husbandry for that ground rather than saying, well, one plough or one non-till fits everything. I mean, you look at the slides here from dung and to fiber FOS spreading, again, organic derived produce. But on the left-hand side of the slides, you'll see soil reports, and it might be a wee bit small, but the microbial activity and soil health are very high on these two samples, which are most our fields are sampled and say the similar thing. But we historically have been a plough-based system with potatoes through all the ground, but yet we have a high microbial and high soil health index on these metrics. There are different metrics, different ways to assess soil health, but on these metrics anyway, which I'm quite proud of. Yeah, we're good. So it adds the previous question: are we damaging the soils by what we're doing? So yeah, moving on, cultivation techniques. So as mentioned, historically plough-based, but we're moving towards reduced tillage, zero till where we can. But as I've said earlier, we do have break crops that need full inversion. So that's potato production and peas. So the pictures in front, yeah, on the right-hand side, we've got our zero-till drill. That's currently going to, that picture is a min-till situation, but we are now direct drilling. And it gives another string to the bow, another ability to use the right machine at the right time. I'm quite happy to say I'm not going to get rid of my plough. I need it for certain parts of my rotation, but it's appropriate tillage or appropriate tools for the job. Where we can, we use cover crops as a cultivation technique. I think there's a lot to be said about cover crops, but I'm looking at them as a cultivation technique. I've got a root mass under the ground that I'm going to drill directly into. I've been made a fool of by cover crops previously with non-establishment, not treating them as a proper crop. This is just a cheap and cheerful grass, clover, and sweepings mix, pretty much. A green cover over winter to provide a root mass. It doesn't have to be a fancy seed mix. As long as there's something there, it's growing, it's retaining the soil, and as a slight note as well, it was hammered with geese the last 2 months, and I'm really happy that they're hammering my grass cover crop because they're not hammering my winter barley or my wheats. Anecdotal evidence, but it's another plus for cover crops. So yeah, the picture on the left of your screen is the cultivation trials we're doing. I'll lead on to the next slide, but that field is a three-way trial of cultivation. So we have ploughed ground to the right-hand side of that picture. We have zero till in the centre, and we have min-till on the left-hand side. And again, we're getting comparisons, and it's a great way to try things out on your own farm, rather than being told by people how to progress. So yeah, on farm we do a lot of applications and trials. So we've trialed a wide range on farm, from different seeds, different seed dressings, different endophyte dressings, different cultivation types, variable rate fungicide and PGR, using green air indexes, satellite imagery, different fungicide trials, different fertilizer trials. I just find it's a great way of understanding your own ground and what these different products can do. It's a great way of learning, and you've got to be open to learning these little changes, incremental gains to your good practice to farm profitability. You know, the majority of these trials you get paid in kind, but you know, it's you're getting your free seed, or you're getting your free plant protection products. It all helps the enterprise farm margin. So it's not to be, yes, it's a bit more of a hassle harvesting, but the pros outweigh the cons for sure, and learning and being open to learn, and just getting different insights on how to do things is great. And then yeah, again, IPM, fires, natural predators, it's great. So I'm in the agri-environment climate scheme. I use my field margins as in pollinator mixes rather than just grasses. So we have natural habitats for natural predators. It's understanding our IPM, our insect or our disease thresholds. So we only apply when it's actually going to be damaging to the crop. As Alan mentioned as well, patience is a key part of IPM, and that, which is a challenge for those of us who want to change and be reactive and responsive. Have hedges as well. A nice natural living boundary. Not only helps wildlife, but it's being used for greening now as well, so it's a win-win. Natural boundaries as well, as much as I focus on cereals here, it's a natural boundary for livestock as well, so we're, as a closed herd, we're needing less antibiotics or less vaccinations, because we know that we've got a physical boundary around the farm as well, so it's all helping in that reduction. Going back to like the thresholds, you know, if we just spray when we see our first aphid, for example, we kill the good ones as well as the bad ones, and it's not a big deal to have a few insects on your crop. It's knowing your thresholds. Nature recovers really well when it's already there. The bottom right picture, hopefully you can see the wisps of cobweb in the sunshine, taken just November, I think, last year. Again, I mean, that's a first year wheat out of potatoes. So as a potato grower, that's had quite a lot thrown at it, that field. Excuse the small bald patch there of open soil, but you can see the cobwebs on the plants there beside it on a grass field. It was even thicker, and top right is the whiteness on my wellies. It was cobwebs walking through them, and I just think that's a badge of pride of having the amount of natural predators and good things on the farm. We haven't used insecticides for quite a while, or avoid them as much as possible. Yes, in potatoes and higher value crops, we have put them on, but as you can see, because it's there already, the predators, they recover quicker. So you can still have perceived healthy soils in some metrics, but be a potato farmer, which there are far worse things to do than grow potatoes, like vegetables. God. Anyway, so yeah, moving on to part of the understanding of what we're doing with IPM and how we apply our produce is my team. We're certified operators, whether they're on it all the time or partly on it. Everyone goes through certified operator courses. Certified machines, it's a real basic 101. The amount of money, especially now if you're putting liquid through liquid fertilizer through a sprayer, you know, everything's expensive. Having your machines gone through the National Sprayer Testing Scheme, it's basic, and then it ties in nice with quality assurance requires it annually now, going forward from June, I think. But to have your machine set up correctly so that we're putting our money in the right place, is a no-brainer. 60% of fails of the NSTS are still leaks coming from the sprayer. Only half of those sprayers inspected have no faults. So there's still a long way to go as an industry and as operators to get our kit in fit state for applying these high value products onto our crops where we need our margins. So yeah, and I think the flowers top left picture, yeah, that's had a visit from Phil Jarvis. He is the UK chair of the VI as well, just to look at some sunflowers. It's not the best of pictures, but just threw it in there as well. And pretty much that's a quick whistle stop tour through my slides, Michelle, because I appreciate you're getting short time. So,
no, that's perfect. I'm not going to read too much about time because we're still on track for 12:30, I think. But that was a great overview. So thank you for that. I look forward to bringing you back for the panel session. And then our last speaker this morning is going to be David Agwin, who hasn't got slides, but I was hoping that he could talk about his sort of lessons he's learning and what he's aiming to achieve and learn about regenerative agriculture through the AHDB Strategic Farm programme. So I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on where you think you're headed and what you think the lessons could be and where we are so far in that journey, David.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's been interesting listening to some of the speakers this morning and where it ties in with what we're trying to do here at Balburney Home Farms. And I just thought I'd put up one, I'll share my screen if I can, just to put up this here, which hopefully you can all see in a minute.
Yeah, we've got that.
Agric a year ago or so as part of the strategic farm. Disappointing, the big area that says 60% of our emissions are to do with the beef, but we'll draw a veil over that for the time being. But what it does stand out to us is the fertilizer side of it. Fertilizer is massive. If we're aiming for net zero or a net reduction of carbon emissions of some description, we're going to have to tackle the fertilizer first and foremost, in my view. If you look at our fuel, it's only 7%, electricity 1%, and other stuff. It's not a lot. We've got to start hitting at the big numbers, which may include the beef cows as well. But we'll leave that for another day. So where we are with that is soil's driving our system here, soil health, biology, nutrition here at Balburney. And that's very much what we're looking at too in the strategic farm as well. And with that, we're very heavily invested in cover crops and minimal or no cultivations if we can. About 75% of our arable area is now direct drilled annually. Some of that twice if it gets a cover crop in it in between crops or usually over winter. And we're also growing an area of cover crops through the summer as well. A lot of arable farms around about. Historically, we've kind of pushed the livestock to the poor end of the farm and just kept them there, as it were, on the grass and heavily cropped the rest of the farm. Where now we're trying to move the livestock back onto the rest of the farm, which of course requires a lot of investment with fences and water, etc. But we've got to start somewhere. The aim is to try and reduce this carbon bit of the fertilizer and just generally build the soil health by cycling the nutrition around in the system through the animals back into the soil, opening up the soil structure so that we're getting better drainage and better able for the crops to mine any nutrition that they can out of the soil. We're sandy loam soil here. In the last 2-3 years, we've really suffered with these long dry spells in the spring and in the summertime. It doesn't matter how much fertilizer we throw at the crops. They're not going to be big crops if we run out of water. So it's becoming really apparent that we need need to build the organic matter back into some of these soils to improve their water holding capacity, which in the future is going to hopefully drive the business on.
Sorry to interrupt, David. You're a bit broken up. I don't know whether it might be worth turning off your camera. It's a shame to not see your face, but sometimes that can improve things.
That's not a bad thing. That's better. Try that now. Right. So yeah, we're where was I? Building organic matter to try and get some more water holding capacity in our soils to see us through these long dry spells that we seem to be getting more of now. Not only that, but building the structure in the soil, either the drainage of the excess water we get in the winter time, albeit at the minute we're having a lovely dry winter. So it seems almost irrelevant at the minute, but I'm sure that'll change. So that we're not sitting with as much ponding and the soil drains better as well in the spring when we want to get on and get sowing. Becoming more, going back in time almost, where livestock were a bigger part of the business rather than just intensifying arable side of it. We do have vegetables and root crops in the rotation, which may or may not be better than potatoes, Dave, I don't know. But they are, what's become apparent over the years is they are hugely damaging to our soils here. And we've actually scaled back the area because it's is lost in reduced yields in subsequent years. So we've scaled those areas back to try and give the comment very early on that was made in one of the speakers' talks was about the importance of knowledge transfer and speaking to your peers and things like that. It is farming the way we are farming, call it regenerative or conservation or what have you, or perhaps just good old-fashioned farming practice. It becomes more of a management time rather than time spent on tractors chasing up and down fields as much. So we're trying to relearn all that, things that were known 50, 60, 100 years ago maybe, but we've just forgotten. We've tended to throw, we've been guilty of it here a lot, throw more horsepower and more diesel at the problem, and that'll get us out of it. Well, I think our soil is now rebelling, so it's time to stop putting the diesel in the tank and start thinking of a different way of doing it. So that's really a very brief rundown of where we're at.
That's brilliant, David. Thank you for that brief rundown. That's a perfect way of starting. And what we're going to do is we're going to head right back to the beginning, and you've touched on IPM in what you were saying, and we're going to be joined by the panelists. And the first thing that springs to mind is we talk about IPM, and Henry gave us a great talk about uptake of IPM. But Henry, if you've got any thoughts on what the limitations in the uptake are?
So there can be multiple barriers to uptake, and they can be technological, they can be economic. Some IPM practices require an initial investment or more labour costs. But I think a lot of the barriers that are restricting further uptake to IPM, where there's not the information there, where there's not the evidence there, happen elsewhere in the supply chain. So the retailers and certain processors and that have a massive influence over the IPM that's being practiced on farm. And so trying to encourage the potential risks associated with or costs associated with a change in practice towards more IPM need to be sort of shared amongst others in the supply chain. It shouldn't all be demands placed on the farmer and the agronomist as well, I suppose. There needs to be some discussion there that takes some of that power, some of that IPM decision making away from those key players in the supply chain.
That's brilliant. And I don't know whether David or Alan have any thoughts. I thought the 4 points to a good IPM plan, time, patience, energy and planning from Alan were a great thought. And I don't know if any of you guys farming have thoughts on what limits the uptake of IPM and where you could see opportunities for change and things like that.
Henry's covered all of it really, because he's king of IPM really, and understanding what goes on. But I would just say, as growers, as farmers, sometimes we're doing it already. It doesn't. Sometimes it's bounded about, oh, IPM this, IPM that, but it's basic knowledge of your own farming practices and growing, and we shouldn't be. We're doing it already, is what I'm getting at, and we don't know we're doing it. And it's recording what we're doing, and equally important, I forgot to mention, is we've got to actually record why we don't do it. It's equally important to say, I'm not going to put an insecticide or a plant protection product on a crop because it hasn't reached a threshold, and it's going to be a lot harder sell for sure, but we're doing it already. Yeah.
That's a great way to put it, and I couldn't agree more. I think sometimes we forget how much every decision is made with reasoning, and a lot of that reasoning is all about IPM. So that's a great way to put it. Thank you, David. So moving on, we went from IPM and then we went into understanding carbon, and I was interested to know whether that was something, particularly when thinking about fertilizer this season, whether it was purely driven by price or whether it was driven by carbon, whether that's come into your thinking yet on farm. So we'll start with David Aglin, if that's okay. Have you started thinking about carbon? Is it one of the key drivers in decision making yet?
Yeah, we've been thinking about carbon for a few years here. Started out at a very basic level, and that if you're spending money, you're probably buying carbon onto the farm, whether it's fuel, stock feed, fertilizer, steel, whatever it is. There's a whole chunk of carbon involved in there somewhere. By having, I suppose that's where our soil health is driving us to as well. You know, we've cover crops on basically pretty much all the farm that isn't cropped with a cash crop at the minute this winter, which is the first time we've been that successful. On those cover crops at the minute, it's been a super winter for them. They're pumping carbon of some type and quantity into the soil all the time. And that's just, it's doing lots of things. It's putting carbon in, it's cultivating the soil, as Dave highlighted for us before the spring. I think, that's the way to look at it. If you look at carbon as cash, if you're spending lots of money, you're probably buying carbon. If you're not, then perhaps the opposite. But it's just trying to, the carbon and organic matter are very, there's a link there. And if you're building that, you're going to help your soil as well. So it's hugely important for us. Whether it turns into something we can market, there are people selling it now. We're looking at it. Whether there's a whole other debate there, whether it's the right or wrong thing to do. But I think personally, if there's cash to be had, we might as well take that too. Our marketplace, the people we trade with and things like that, they're going to want hold of it. So it's going to come. If it doesn't come from us, it's going to come from them one way or another.
Excellent thoughts, David. I think you're very right. We then moved from carbon and we talked about the alternative products, and it was great to hear some of the farmers talk about their use of biostimulants and how they could potentially fit in the future as well. But also it was great that Neil ran us through some of the alternative products, and we've got a few questions come in about those. Firstly, the question came in to ask whether they were available for organic crops and whether they're organically registered. So I don't know whether you could answer that for us, please, Neil.
I saw the question, Michelle, and I had a quick look. I couldn't see anything on the Soil Association website. I noticed we've got someone from UPL on the call. I don't know if is one of the attendees. I don't know if they could type in an answer. It may be something to do with the formulation if it's not approved, but the actual product is derived from brown seaweed, the laminarin. So I can't see any reason why it wouldn't be approved for organic crops. But The only thing I could think of is if there's anything in the formulation that the organic certifying bodies might not approve of.
Brilliant. And there was a question about whether the differences were significant and how promising they could be for farmers, and what their consistency is. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, crops vary from year to year. As we know, disease pressures vary from year to year. The kind of responses we get goes the same for all plant protection products. What we do see consistently across years is this approach of elicitors of the T0 and in reduced rate gives you that yield response, and it gives you a significant return. And there was another question, I think, about cost as well. So the cost of the laminarin input and then cutting down your fungicide, it easily covers the cost of cutting your fungicides from half rate to quarter rate. The laminarin easily covers that. So yes, it's very promising, I think.
Brilliant. And Andy in the audience has messaged in to say that amino A is allowed in organics. So hopefully that helps anybody that's interested. So we went from alternative products and we talked about cover crops, and it's great to see how they're being used on some of the farms that are going. But simple question to start with, what are the best sorts of cover crops for overwintering in Scotland? What's the options, do you think?
Well, whatever you can get that will grow is the key thing. So, I mean, as I said, the type that we'd used was the vetch and the rye, just because from previous work we'd done, any small seeded type was tricky. I mean, I've answered some of the questions in the answer bit as well. I mean, you may be able to kind of use beans or something like that as a possibility, but it's whatever you can get in there. I mean, I know some of the kind of the brassicas will grow okay, but again, you've got to get them in early enough, just to get them trying to get them established without too much effort. And I think I forgot which farmer it was, it kind of said, well, there's a few had kind of said they'd had a few disasters, and I don't know how much of that was due to kind of lateness of sowing or, just strange weather periods that kind of affected what they'd got, and they just hadn't got the biomass, or it was really patchy, that kind of stuff. But yeah, in terms of what we'd got, unless it was an undersown cereal or something like that when it'd been established earlier on with clovers and things like that, the one that consistently worked for us has been vetch and rye. But again, there's issues with the rye. I think somebody had said, can you swap the rye for oats or something like that? Well, theoretically, yes, you could. You're trying to get a bulk of material. So again, using some of the kind of the websites that I'd kind of highlighted may give you some indication of what may work as well. And there's loads of seed companies that are producing mixes and things like that for specific areas, but how much of those are actually really, really focused at Scotland is take your pick on that one.
Dave, you mentioned that you'd had some issues with cover crops. Was it the timings, you think?
It was just following on from Robin's point. I've been made a fool of with cover crops. I think it's my own to get a good cover crop, you have to treat it as a crop, as a proper crop, rather than just something to put on over winter. And that was my mistake. Hopefully, I've learned from, and only put it in the ground and establish it if it's in the correct timing window and ground conditions. Same as you shouldn't puddle in wheat in a wet month. It's that patience again. It's that waiting for the right conditions, and there's no point putting effort into establishing a cover crop if it's not going to grow, or you're not going to get the next year's benefits, the biomass, the root mass to drill into, to put back into the ground, whether it's for they all have different qualities, and you really got to treat it as a crop. I was always going to kind of mention to get the best out of it.
Brilliant. And also, Alan, you actually said the exact words, we need to get cover crops in early enough. Is that what sort of mixes would you be looking at? What would you be including in your cover crop mixes?
Yeah, you're dead right in what everything's been said. Earliness is a thing. It's okay for 2 Daves, if you like, down in Fife in God's country. In England, they get it in fine and early, but up in the northeast of Scotland, it is that bit later. So earliness is the key. And like I said earlier, the couple of guys that I do work for have just used farm saved seed, which is quite a bit cheaper, if you like, just their own spring barley, oats and so on. And conventional oilseed rape as well, spun into a standing crop. So keep it cheap, but get it in early. Brilliant.
That's a great take home for those. So from cover crops, we then looked at the last session was on soil. So a few of you have mentioned soil and its importance and all of those sorts of things. And I think it actually comes through in all of the talks about how important it was. So when you think about soil, and I know that Julian's managed to get back in as well, so Julian may have some comments. But is there any big top tips that you would tell a farmer when thinking about soil health? Where would you start if this is the start of your soil health journey?
Do you want me to start on that one?
Yes, please.
Well, obviously, I think soil's really important. I probably would say that, wouldn't I? I mean, I think it's important that you get some information first of all. If you're not sure about what kind of soil texture you've got, what kind of soil types you've got, it's worth going down that route. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. You can do this by hand. There's relatively easy information where you can feel how gritty it is. Will it roll into a ball? Does it take can you shine it to see how much clay, sand and silt's in there? And I think once you've got that information, then you can start making your management decisions. But at some point, I think you're going to have to do some assessments of the soil, some analysis of that soil, so you've got a baseline so you know what you're working for. I think it's very important that you've got some kind of information, then you can take that forward to start making some management decisions and seeing how you can improve that. What areas do you need to improve? An example of this is in the dairy farming. We tend to find a lot of the fields very close to the slurry tank and the slurry tower. I've got high levels of phosphorus. We don't even need soil maps to show us that. I can probably tell a farmer that when I go out to the farm. And so if he's still putting fertilizer on that's got a P component to that, I'd be saying, why are you doing that? That's wasting your money there. You've got sufficient P that you don't need to have that component. Let's think what else we can do here. And potentially it's the fields on the outskirts of the farm, furthest from the tank, that's got the lowest amounts of P. Is that true? If it is, then we need to start changing some of the management of application of that slurry.
Brilliant. And we talked about organic matter, and we're going to go off and talk to David and Alan. But first, I wanted to ask you about the different methods for measuring organic matter and whether there was a difference and which would be the preferred, if or not there was a preferred option.
Good question. Yes, there are different methods of measuring this. There's DUMAS and there's loss on ignition. We just as a kind of consensus within the group that's been working with the AHDB project on soil quality, I've kind of moved towards loss on ignition because it tells you sufficient amounts of information that you can use that to make decisions on your soils. But I would say if you'd already had it analysed in DUMAS, then there's ways of converting that one from the other. That's not difficult. But if you've started down one route, then make sure you're aware of how the next sample has been taken and been analysed. So you're comparing like with like. So you can follow that through and see what changes there are. As well, the annoying thing somewhat about soil organic matter, it takes quite a long, it's not a very sensitive measure, so it takes a while, years, to know whether you've seen changes in that, measurable changes. So it's something that you need to be slightly patient with when you're doing your analysis, and don't expect, if you take one sample one year, you grow a cover crop, then you're going to see a big change in your next year's sampling. So, but I think just consistency of where you take the sample in the field, how you take the sample, and how you have the analysis done is important. So you, once you start comparing these over time, you're comparing like with like.
Yeah, can I add in there, Michele? Paul's 100% right. As I said earlier, I've been doing it for 20 years, and I did check my analysis just before this talk. It all goes to Land Crop. They've always done the same method of analysis. I checked that out. So, as I say, mine's is steadily rising, but it's very important that you're consistent and you know where you are.
Brilliant. And I'm not sure whether David Aglin can talk about soil organic matter. Is your soil organic matter, what sort of level is it sat at, and where would you like it to be? Where are you headed? What do you think is the goal? Is there a goal, or do we just aim to get it as high as possible?
Yeah, I would aim as high as possible. I don't know what the end result is going to be. We've got fields at 4, we've got fields at 9, and we haven't tested it all yet. There's too much, we're a long way from that. But I would say starting point, Paul's points were good about, getting your baseline, but the soil health and soil structure is, get some roots in the soil all the time and stop cultivating, and that'll improve your soil structure and soil health quicker than anything, I would suggest. That's been my bit. Easier to say and harder to do, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I'm not sure whether Dave Bell might have comments on that as well.
Yeah, I think my understanding, and I'm aware I'm on a screen here with many experts who know far more than I do, but my understanding of different soils have different capacities for organic matter, and to say that we're targeting a specific number generally is maybe unhelpful when yes, we need to target going up, as David Aglin says, but the different soil have different holding capacities, and it's to understand our different soils. And like Paul was saying, the first step for soil health is just starting, and it's just personally, I'd say get your hands dirty, just get a bit of soil, rub it in your hands, smell it. I mean, smell is such a great way of understanding a healthy soil. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that we do all these things subconsciously almost, and a lot of us are doing them already, and it's just now we're calling them a specific name, or we're having to label it as something we're doing rather than what we've always done and understood through generations. So it's not actually new, it's just being highlighted to the front again.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think that a lot of farmers in meetings will ask for that golden number, and we almost want that one silver bullet right answer to everything. And I think the most important thing is understanding that actually just doing everything better, those incremental changes, there's a big part to play in everything that we do, and a lot of it is already heading in the right direction. Fab. So I'm going to go to the weather because I think it's important, and it talks about everything, and it's something that David Aglin brought on and talked about water holding capability and all of those sorts of things. And in a way, lots of the elements that we've discussed today touch on what potentially could benefit that with the cover crops, with the soil health and all of those sorts of things. Do you think that that's got the importance to it? Do you think we have the understanding that we need with it? Do you think that will be a big factor in the future? So since you're on the screen, Dave, I'll head to you first.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions in the chat from Celine was, what do my neighbours think? And yeah, I'm sure they have a great chuckle and a great at all these different weird and wonderful things that are far too close to the roadside for that I'm trialing out. But one of I mean, as I said, damage to soil health, pea viners. If you've ever had anything to do with peas, they come in when the peas are ready, whether you like it or not, whether it's raining, sun, snow, whatever. If the peas are ready, they come for them. And so they come in a route, and they did our neighbours first. And to say it looked like the Somme was an understatement, and the damage to that was horrific. And I was really fearful of when they came to us, because they were coming to us the next day. And again, field right outside the road, so just where it was, but they didn't leave a mark. And we had some heavy rain, didn't leave a mark, and it's just resilient soils. And because we're doing little and often, and just even though they've been ploughed constantly, they've also had their muck manures applied to them. We've tried and use as low pressure as we can justify and expect, and it's all these little incremental differences. We all add up to the end, and when they could drive in and out, and I wouldn't say there's no mud on the road, but there was very little in comparison. We didn't need to put signs up per se, but it's just these stark differences that all add up, and it gives you a sense of yeah. I don't want to be too up myself, but yeah, it was quite a moment of pride when you know you're doing something right. It confirms what you thought you were doing. So yeah.
Brilliant. And I'm actually going to pass the same question back to David, and then we'll go to Alan afterwards. But David, do you think that there's been a change in what your farming neighbours think? Do you think there's been a change in the questions that you're being asked and all of those sorts of things?
Yes, they still think we're potty, which is probably a fair assessment. But there are definitely more. I mean, we've seen demonstrations of no-till drills and things on neighbouring farms now. We're seeing more and more growing cover crops or asking about it. But there's a band of us in the area locally that are doing this anyway, to a greater or lesser extent. So there is more interest. I'm not sure if it's because there's subsidy to be had with it, or if it's environmental scheme stuff, or if it's just because they want to try it and see. Because just like Dave, we've had plenty of spectacular failures with cover crops as well. So it doesn't always look like a bed of roses. But yeah, definitely there's a building interest. There's a building interest, which is good to see. We're not completely potty.
Brilliant. And I don't know whether, Alan, you've seen similar?
Yeah, as David said, there is interest. There's more and more people trying it, even up in the northeast here. There's more cover crops being tried. The same with min-till and no-till. But as he alluded to earlier, one guy once said to me, the first thing you've got to do before you go down min-till or no-till is you want to plant hedges so that your neighbours can't see what you're doing. But yes, you've got to put up with a bit of a mess for a start. But if you don't try things, you don't know. So hey ho, see what the future brings.
Brilliant. And that's actually something I wrote down that Julian said, that we all need to start trying things out. And I think that resonates with all these things, whether it be looking at reducing carbon, cover crops, or soil health, and all of those sorts of things. We've got to start trying things out. And that's something that resonates from Dave, and you, Alan, that you've all trying things and doing things like that. Is there anything that you'd would be the first place that you tell a farmer to start? What would be your first thing to do, other than planting hedges to hide anything? Where would you start your journey if you had to start it again?
Just start easy. You know, it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be. I wouldn't buy anything particular. Wouldn't spend any investment on kit. I mean, you think of a one-pass drill, for example. If you want to try reduced tillage, just go into your stubbles and use your power harrow straight into stubble and drill. It's less inversion tillage than than ploughing, and it's a way forward. And to try things out, you don't want to spend money on it. Just use what you have already. Little steps, but plenty of them. And small steps are always the easiest ones to start with. So yeah, and it's learning. I mean, one of my pet hates is trial and error. It's trial and progression. It's only an error if we don't learn from it. So it's as long as you realize what you've done, how can you make it different? How can you improve on it? It's just a general progression.
I would just add there, trial and error, as Dave said, but maybe one important thing is don't try, let's say, an Amazon this year and a Claydon next year and Missouri in the following year. You want to have the same system in the same year with the same crop. Because if you try one crop with one machine one year and another totally different system next year, it can be so different. So get in contractors and just try a little bit of each and see how it goes.
Brilliant. And I don't know whether David Aglin's got anything to add. Where would you start your journey again now if you had the opportunity?
Yeah, don't spend money. Pick a field corner. Doesn't matter if people can see it or not, and just try stuff and try it for 2 or 3 years. We'll be 5, 6, 7 years into this now, and things are really coming right now. It takes that long to just learning. So yeah, pick a field corner and go for it, and yeah, enjoy it.
Fab. And that is, we have just a couple of last quick fire questions. So Paul, what's the impact on worm numbers if you use digestates and slurry? So quick fire questions to finish off.
I've not got a great deal of information on that, but we've from one farm that was dealing with visited up near Elgin, who were using some of these digestates, then really didn't see any reduction in worm numbers, potentially saw a slight increase. They were going on to grassland systems, so potentially that's got a difference there. There may be physical absorption and better ways of protecting the worm from adding that to it. But yeah, the information I've got there is it's not detrimental, but that was one farm in one area of the country, so I wouldn't base everything on that.
Brilliant. And then it was specifically asked to Dave Bell, but I'll be interested to know whether David and Alan are thinking about the same. You talked about using phosphate in manures and fibrofos and things like that. Do you know what your soil sorption capacity is of your soil, Dave?
Nope.
I don't know whether Paul has any thoughts on whether it's something we need to be looking more into or any things like that, or I don't know whether either David or Alan have thought about it.
Well, I've thought about it plenty when I did my facts course. We went through all the sorption things, but to answer his question, no, but I could very easily look it up. Yeah.
Brilliant. And then the last question is, if you had to do it all, cover crops and all of those sorts of things, do you think that there is an option for, is it going to be payments that drive change, or is it going to be the sustainability? How can we grow a more sustainable future? Do you think there is an option there for more of this being included? How do you think we could increase uptake? So to David, Dave and Alan. So we'll start with Alan, you're on the screen.
Sorry, I was muted. Pass. I'll sit in the fence in this one. I'll sit in the fence. I'll come after the two Daves and see what they have to say.
It made Dave laugh, so you can go next. I could see you laughing on the screen. So have you got any thoughts? Is it all going to be driven by payments, do you think? Or
I think that's above my pay grade for sure. And I am fearful it's going to be driven by ill-advised policy. I think it's important for our farming representatives, our unions, our lobbyists to make it clear to those who dictate policy what actually. I mean, you can see on social media the challenges to some experts' views. David McCracken has put his views up about biodiversity and farming, and to the arable farmer or the lowland farmer is quite challenged by some of his views. And it's just, personally, I think there's no one size that fits all. It's about keeping the right tools for the right kind of ground. It's the right applications for the right crop, rather than this process goes over everything. And that is the real challenge, to retain active ingredients that are relevant to a crop, and retain practices that are relevant to that type of ground. And that is fearful that we are all lumped in one pigeonhole, which I strongly disagree with pigeonholing in modern farming. I think it takes away rather than adds to the conversation. But I'll not expand on that one just too much.
No, that's fab. And I don't know whether David Aglin's got anything to add. I think you rounded it off very well. But anything to add, David?
I think, yeah, Dave did a good job, that answer. Saved me. I think a lot of it will be driven by payments, sadly, because it's seen as a cost, I suppose. Whereas we've integrated it into the business now, and we don't view it in the same way. I think knowledge transfer will have a big impact. Peer-to-peer learning, as we start to hopefully be able to demonstrate a positive financial return on some of these methods that make it a bit more clear-cut for people to take the decision. But of all the people that I know who are doing it, and people around the world that have been doing it for an awful lot longer than we have, decades, I don't think anybody's ever said they regret it and they would go back, which tells a big story. That says a lot, probably. But yeah, we're a mixture of both, really.
Brilliant. And I don't know whether any of the experts have anything to add. I don't know whether anyone wants to say anything just as we draw to a close.
I think, between all the stakeholder groups looking at climate change and things like that, we're always stressing that farmers need a menu of options so that they can work with what works for them best, and trying to work on actual results and not the methods, because they're so different between farms, and we've just learned that today. So keep it flexible for the policymakers was what we were trying to say.
Brilliant. Great to hear, Julian. Thank you. So all it leaves you to do is to draw things to a close. I will say in the chat just now, if you want to have a quick look, there is a link for a survey for feedback. It'd be greatly appreciated if you could do that. It leaves me to say thank you to Henry, Julian, Neil, Robin, Paul, Alan, Dave and David. So thank you very much for joining what is the last of the Agronomy Roadshow series, where we were looking at growing a sustainable future. I hope everybody has enjoyed it and has got something to take away from the session. Don't forget, you can watch back this recording, so don't hesitate to go back and revisit anything, or equally I'm sure that none of the panelists would mind if you were to get in touch with them to clarify anything or to ask further questions. So please do make the most of all of your resources, and thank you for joining us. If you haven't already claimed your basis on Roadshow points, they can go into the Q&A, and don't forget to do the survey. Thank you all very much for your time. I hope you have a really good day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.